The Supreme Court has ruled that presidents have broad immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts carried out while in office, a decision earning praise from former President Donald Trump and a swift rebuke from President Biden and many on the left.
Obama dropped missiles and they ended up hitting a kindergarten or a school. What would happen to Biden? He's killed our country with his policies. The border is a disaster. If a president is afraid to act because they're worried about being indicted when they leave office, if they don't have immunity, no president is going to act.
Now the man who sent that mob to the U.S. Capitol is facing potential criminal conviction for what happened that day. And the American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election. Now, because of today's decision, that is highly, highly unlikely.
On Monday, the former president's legal team sent a pre-motion letter requesting his sentencing in New York, which was initially set for July 11th, be delayed following the Supreme Court ruling. Hours after that, Manhattan prosecutors agreed with this request. On Tuesday, Judge Juan Merchan announced the former president's sentencing will be adjourned until September 18th. Meanwhile, after the CNN presidential debate, many Democrats seem to be scrambling following America's reaction to President Biden's performance, with the question of whether the president will remain as the Democratic presidential nominee weighing heavy in the air. To discuss this and more, we bring in our panel. Host of Sunday Night in America on Fox and the Trey Gowdy podcast, Trey Gowdy. Former Tennessee Congressman, co-host of The Five, Harold Ford Jr., and Fox News Radio political analyst, Josh Kraushaar. Trey, the fallout from that Supreme Court nomination obviously is wide and a lot of reaction to it. The left seems to have said all kinds of things could happen, but one thing has happened, and that's delay the sentencing until September, past the conventions and just in front of the November election.
Yeah, I guess I'm naive. This ruling benefits all presidents, past and future. It's a victory for the executive branch. I guess for those who wanted to see the former president in a courtroom standing trial again between now and November, it's a loss. But perhaps somebody can correct my recollection. I think former President Obama may have ordered the killing of an American citizen who is a threat to our national security. I have never heard anyone argue that he should be prosecuted for that. Judge Juan Merchan really had no choice because some of the witnesses actually testified to events that took place while President Trump was president. So that does not mean per se that those were official acts. It just means that he has to flesh out what Chief Justice Roberts called that zone of twilight, or that penumbra, that periphery of whether or not something is actually an express power of the presidency, or if it is indeed in that penumbra.
Yeah. And Harold, the reaction to it has almost seemed to galvanize a little bit of the left, not only running now against Donald Trump, but also running against the Supreme Court and the increased power that the court has given Donald Trump should he win.
I think you're right. I think and I think Trey's analysis of it is about spot on. I think a couple of things from the way the court did it and the timing of the court, when they did it. I think many people believe if they were going to decide the way they decided, which I think was probably about 80-90% right, why did they wait so long to do it? Because from the very beginning, I think I might have heard Trey and other smart minds around this suggesting this would probably be the way the court would have decided this. They basically have said it's a case-by-case analysis of an official act versus an unofficial act. And I think some of the Democrats and even others who may not be Democrat, Republicans, who may have issues with what happened January 6th, because whatever the court may say about January 6th, and the court really didn't say anything about January 6th. It actually was evaluating whether or not what a president has immunity for. But we all have in our minds January 6th as the coloring and illuminating kind of background for the case. And the court went beyond that. The truth is a president should be immune for certain things, and I think Trey laid out one with President Obama. But it's almost like the old line about pornography. You know it when you see it. And I think a lot of people believe what they saw on January 6th was something that was beyond the pale. And now the lower courts will now have to develop the record and flesh out the details and facts there. And I don't think anyone should be surprised if it comes back before the court that there are elements of what happened on January 6th that the Supreme Court may conclude, because I think the case is going to come back to the Supreme Court. I think there may be elements and facts around January 6th that may constitute an unofficial act. And we shall see what the court may do if they're presented with those facts.
And Justice Amy Coney Barrett said as much in her writing on one of the elements of that case. Josh, meanwhile, there's just, it seems, story after story, a scrambling at the White House. Axios said it was freaking out inside the White House. Others have characterized it roughly the same, as there are now more and more Democrats on the record saying that President Biden should not be the nominee. Some have endorsed Vice President Harris. Others say there should be a process. But the bottom line is that the voices are growing.
Brett, there is downright panic in Democratic circles because they're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't moment where, new polling shows Joe Biden could perhaps be the worst possible Democratic candidate to run up against Donald Trump. There was a new poll out today showing the current president down 6 points outside the margin of error and doing worse than every other Democrat tested, including the vice president. But the option of blowing up the top of the ticket in July and trying to have some messy succession scheme with not a whole lot of time left is not a very promising course either. I think polling and I think you're starting to see lawmakers, leadership in the Democratic Party starting to look at the numbers, starting to look at the data. And ultimately, that may be what ends up creating a groundswell of voices calling Biden to step aside. Only the president can make this decision. Really, he's going to have to ultimately come to the conclusion that he's just unable to defeat Donald Trump and doesn't have the mental acuity and the energy to do so. But until that happens, we're going to be seeing news of polls showing Biden trailing in battleground states. There was a story from Puck this afternoon showing states like New Hampshire, Virginia, and New Mexico neck and neck after the debate. So that's going to, the data, the numbers, that's going to be what drives a lot of Democrats and their decision making, because they're not going to want to go into a November election with landslide type numbers against Donald Trump that they could be facing.
Yeah, because Trey, Congress is looking after themselves too. They forget the coattails. They don't want to get hurt by the top of the ticket. And if you had single digits in New Jersey before the debate, to Josh's point, things could move.
Yeah, I hate to sound cynical, Brett. You know that, but members of Congress are singularly focused on one thing, which is their own reelection. And they're all for party unity until it begins to impact them personally. I'm not an expert on the Democrat Party, but I don't think the Democrat Party is going to have electoral success without African-American females. So how in the world you pass over Kamala Harris to go with someone else like a Gavin Newsom or a Gretchen Whitmer? I don't know how you do that. So they are in a conundrum, but it is a conundrum of their own making.
Panel, we'll hold it right there.
Harold, do you think, the pushback was very immediate after the Camp David meeting and the family getting together? Apparently, Hunter Biden is in a lot of meetings at the White House now, which is also freaking out a lot of people. But there was a pushback, like really strong. And now there are more and more voices popping up. Is this a slow bleed as they look at the data and the numbers and we get more polls?
So I think it's, as we sit here today, I think it's likelier, and maybe even we've pushed ourselves above the 50% mark, that Joe Biden will not be the nominee for the Democrats this election cycle. To Trey's point about African-American women, remember, Kamala Harris ran in 2020, and she, I think, garnered about 3% of the African-American women vote. I think that's an issue on the minds of a lot of Democrats. But I think most important is finding a nominee to Josh's point, where you see that Joe Biden may be the worst candidate for Democrats heading into the fall. Two, I think the stakes are so high, and Democrats recognize everything from the Supreme Court to whether or not we're going to go to an all-tariff system to generate revenue for the country, to whether or not we find ourselves involved in NATO in a way that protects Europe and our allies around the globe. There are a litany of issues that I think Democrats understand why the election is so important, and why having a nominee who can compete and win against Donald Trump is more important than perhaps any other issue. The dam is starting to break. You've seen, I think, one or two Democratic members of Congress say that Mr. Biden can't win. And I say this not as one who doesn't appreciate or respect the president. I was in college with his son, Beau, who was a year or so ahead of me at Penn, and we were great pals there and continue to be great pals. I traveled around the world with Joe Biden when I was in Congress, when he was a senator, and there was not a smarter, more daring, more thoughtful senator than I had the opportunity to do that with. But as we think about where he is on his service journey now, it's not convincing to more and more Democrats. It seems like by the hour that he is the person best fit to challenge Donald Trump. Now, if it is Kamala Harris, I think she will be a more formidable candidate than perhaps the conventional thinking is about her. And if she becomes the nominee and picks a great vice presidential candidate and talks about the kind of administration she would, and the group of people she would assemble to help her manage and lead the country, I think those are the kinds of things that will not only give Democrats comfort, but maybe even a lot of independents and even some Republicans who might find President Trump someone they don't want to see as president again.
But Josh, the thought of the Bidens relinquishing this nomination, it feels like it is a battle out of their, cold dead hands to get it out of where the family said just days ago it was not going to come.
I mean, that's what makes this so tricky, because it's not like you can have some former presidents like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and some party elders that are making this decision. It's ultimately going to come down to President Biden, his wife Jill Biden, and his close family members, and they're ultimately going to make the decision. I think, look, this week is going to be an interesting one. The president's scheduled an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos to try to show he can handle an unscripted setting, an interview.
Or tell him that he's stepping down.
It could happen. That would be quite an announcement. He's going to be doing a campaign event though that same day, Brett, in Wisconsin. So it sounds like
that's probably true. Yeah,
this is coming to a head, I think, sooner than later. If that interview goes badly, and we're going to be monitoring it for any kind of the kind of scrutiny that maybe other past Biden interviews didn't get, to show he's competent and can actually speak clearly about the issues of the day. If he struggles, that would be that might further the momentum to what Harold and Trey are talking about. Elected officials are not going to want to be running on a ticket with a president who really just can't deliver an effective message, no less, keep up a very vigorous campaign schedule.
Yeah. And Trey, a lot of back and forth at the White House briefing room with Karine Jean-Pierre about cheap fakes and how she was admonishing the press in various corners of taking videos out of context. And that's all out the window.
Yeah, and I actually take zero delight in discussing. Father Time will catch every one of us and beat every one of us. And my dominant reaction Thursday night was one of sadness. In fact, Brett, the first thing I do when I get off your show is ask my wife if I sounded okay. And I am 20-something years younger than President Biden. So it's going to catch all of us, but we're not all running to be the leader of the free world. And at some point, people who profess to care about you have got to say, it is in your best interest to move aside. History is just not replete with instances of people voluntarily giving up power, but it should be. It is not fair to him to put him in a situation. I mean, When he said he beat Medicare, I thought he sounded like the head of the Heritage Foundation. I mean, that's who wants to get rid of Medicare. I didn't think Democrats wanted to beat Medicare. It was awful and sad. That was my dominant reaction.
Yeah. As a 29-year-old Senate candidate, 1972, Joe Biden repeatedly made an issue of the age of his opponent, incumbent Cale Boggs, saying he's lost that old twinkle in his eye he used to have. Boggs at the time was 63 years old. And
Wow.
time changes things and perspectives, Harold.
Look, whenever I get together with my family, which is often, they support everything I want to do, as long as it involves ice cream, as long as it involves sweets, and perhaps going to an amusement park. My kids are 10 and 9. I get the First Lady and others wanting him to be supportive, and I understand Trey's point. I sometimes don't ask my wife those things because I don't want to hear the answer fully. But at the same time, I get it. But that's not what we're talking about here. And I think we're all are coming at it from about the same point here. The one other thing that is I've found a little bit disturbing is that it's been reported that the White House is asking the donor class what they think. And I think the donor class is really, really important. But the donor class, and a lot of them are tech executives, they don't call politicians to ask if they should make investments in tech startups. They don't ask politicians what they think about how they make their money. So as much as I care about their opinion, I care about the opinion of voters. And for me, the polling data, which has been cited and our network has done, Fox has done, is more important than anything. I watched James Carville on one of our shows earlier, or the segment, a clip of something on one of our shows earlier, where he said almost 3/4 of America wants something different than what we have in both Trump and Biden. And Biden's numbers are higher. So what is it that we're trying to respond to? Are we responding to the donor class? Are we responding to the Biden family? Or are we going to respond to voters? And if we're going to respond to voters, I think my party has a big decision to make here in the next 3 to 4 days about who's going to be the nominee and whom we can put up that's strongest to represent our views and our vision for the future.
Josh, I mean, there was a couple of guys today that just came out. Lloyd Doggett, Democrat from Texas, said he represents the heart of congressional district once represented by Lyndon Johnson. Under very different circumstances, he made the choice, a painful decision to withdraw, and President Biden should do the same. Interesting, Jim Clyburn told MSNBC that he will support Vice President Kamala Harris if President Biden were to step aside. I mean, that was Biden's guy that won him South Carolina.
Yeah, and Pelosi too, I believe, gave an interview where she said, there are a lot of legitimate questions raising about what President Biden's debate performance shows about his health and mental acuity. So I think Democratic leaders realize the depth of the problem. They should have realized this a year ago, frankly, Brett. I mean, President Biden was always going to be closer to 90 years old at the end of his second term than 80. I mean, the notion that these questions weren't raised by anyone other than Dean Phillips, really, as far as elected officials going into the primary campaign, is sort of remarkable. But they're having this debate now. I think you're going to hear more lawmakers speak candidly about their concerns, and I think ultimately they're going to be trying to work behind the scenes to convince President Biden perhaps to step aside, and I think Kamala Harris would be the natural successor in that circumstance.
And do you think, Harold, that the party will rally around Kamala Harris?
I think the party will rally around Kamala Harris because the issues have not changed. Understand what has changed. We were led to believe, Democrats, Republicans alike, independents, the country, that the age issue with President Biden was not as significant of an issue because he was sprite, he was energetic, he was a leader in the White House, outside of the White House. And then we saw this debate. We all saw it. And you can't unsee something like that. We sat on that set that night, Brett, and the first 3 or 4 minutes was astonishing. And then after the debate, you think about Thursday evening to Friday till now, he is yet to do an interview. He's yet to do a town hall. He's yet to challenge President Trump to another debate. So you think about those things, and you think about another nominee, and you think about the issues from abortion, the economy, taxes, our foreign policy stances, none of that has changed. So I think that she would be a formidable candidate. She'll have her issues. She'll have to explain things. She'll have to talk about the border and talk about what they have done and what she didn't do or what she did. But to answer your question, I think she would be. And I don't think that she alone she won't be the only person that Democrats consider. If we were having this conversation 3 days ago, it was unlikely that Biden would be. It was less likely he would not be the nominee, and he's still the nominee. But we are 3 days later, and he is more likely not to be the nominee. And I think that, because she's the vice president, and I like her and would support her. But if she's not the nominee, and there are 3 or 4 other names, and there are governors' names who've been floated and thrown around, who I think are formidable as well, I think members of our party are so resolute about ensuring that Donald Trump is not president again. I think people would rally around a serious, thoughtful nominee who could lead the country.
We'll hear more after this.
Trey, it's not that just President Biden hasn't done the town hall or another interview he's doing Stephanopoulos on Friday. He hasn't called a lot of these top Democrats, like in person, called them to say, hey, I've got your back, or, I'm in. And the Democratic governors were apoplectic about that, to the point where they demanded an in-person meeting, which they are going to get this week. But there is something going on as far as not reaching out or not telling the Democratic Party establishment what exactly is happening.
I am left to conclude that there is no good explanation. I mean, whenever I ask someone for an explanation and they respond with silence, I am left to conclude that there is no good explanation for claiming that sisters are raping sisters. There is no good explanation for claiming that we beat Medicare. It was such an awful performance. I wouldn't want to call people and explain what I did either. And I certainly wouldn't want to explain how I'm going to do better the next time around. I will say this, though, about Kamala Harris, and Congressman Ford brought up a great point. But the 4 of us got the exact same number of delegates that she got when she ran the first time. I actually thought Val Demings would have been a much better choice. She was given jurisdiction over the border, which is the number one issue on the minds of the voters. I just do not. I don't know her. Congressman Ford obviously does. In terms of likability, in terms of policy positions, I just think she might be a lucid Kamala Harris might be easier to beat than the current Joe Biden.
Josh, if it was Kamala Harris, what would she do? She'd pick somebody like a Roy Cooper in North Carolina, or a Governor Bashir or something.
Yeah, I think you'd balance the ticket with someone with more moderate credentials. I mean, look, Kamala Harris has better ties to the progressive activist community than Biden. I think there might be some more energy from African-American voters, but she's a turnoff to moderates. She's a turnoff to a lot of the persuadable voters out there. So there would be a trade-off. And I think she might regret not positioning herself more to the middle of the Democratic Party because she's going to be vulnerable in that persuadable center if she is.
It'd be a tough vote for never Trumpers.
Yeah, it would be.
It'd be maybe a sometime Trumper.
Harris would be a tough pill to swallow if she kind of rode the Biden bandwagon on the anti-Trump train, and then you're stuck with Kamala Harris.
Yeah, but Brett, that's why I say I don't. It's not a foregone conclusion that she would be the one. I was only answering your question. I don't disagree with. I mean, Trey wants to call me. I don't disagree with Chairman Gowdy either or Josh. I just my only point is if she is the nominee, the issues have not changed. And when you look at the votes that have been taken across the country to enshrine access to abortion rights for women and families across the country. That issue has not changed. So we've got a lot of time here. And I misspoke. 3/4 of the country says that the Democrats would have a better chance if Biden was not the nominee, according to the most recent poll. I talked about Trump. I didn't mean to do that. I wanted to correct myself on that as well.
Do you think that any of what's going on the Democrat side is going to influence former President Trump's pick as a vice president? In other words, if he's not running against Joe Biden, if he is running against Kamala Harris, does that influence who he picks as a running mate?
Maybe. And whether it's Tim Scott, your buddy, or whether it is maybe a different kind of pick that looks more to the future, like a Glenn Youngkin, or I don't know, even a Mike Pompeo. It's something out of the box that we're looking at here. I do think that it potentially changes that. But of course, Donald Trump would tell you vice presidents don't mean that much. And he'll choose whoever he wants, and he'll make the choice. So in that case, it's probably J.D. Vance. Now, who knows?
Can I ask Chairman Gowdy, if it's Gretchen Whitmer and Wes Moore as the nominees for the Democratic Party, does that influence the way? I think it does. Does that influence the way that Mr. Trump thinks about his second choice?
It better.
Or his second pick?
It better. I'm only aware of one person who has unfavorably compared President Trump to heroin and Hitler, and that's J.D. Vance. I'm not aware of another person on the planet who's unfavorably compared him to those two things. So, whether it's Elise Stefanik, whether it's Tim Scott, whether it's Glenn Youngkin, I think the ticket you just laid out might be tough to beat. You got to balance it with something other than just more of what you are.
It would be something if they do that magical act in this short a time to get a new ticket that does not include Kamala Harris. Josh, I mean, that's a big thing to pull off.
I have a hard time seeing that happening because, by the way, the delegates and the folks representing the party on the convention floor are a couple notches at least to the left of the average Democratic voter. So, leaving it up to those folks to make the decision making on who the nominee, I just would not trust that from being a total mess. So, I mean, Harris would be the safe choice, just as part of the natural sort of succession of things. But look, that's why Democrats have been so hesitant to upset the apple cart, because they know without Biden, there's going to be a lot of ambitious Democrats looking to make a play for the nomination.
We play these parlor games and about vice president, about tickets for months on months and months for a presidential election. Now we are getting to the end, and the parlor game is essentially on Red Bull. It is, we are full on parlor game here because anything could happen on both sides. And that's what makes it so interesting. Panel, thanks a lot. Now for a bit of history. July 4th, 1976, President Ford traveled the U.S. celebrating America's bicentennial. On the 200th anniversary of America's independence, President Ford made it his mission to celebrate accordingly. He began his day traveling to Pennsylvania with his daughter Susan, where he spoke at Valley Forge before heading to Independence Hall in Philadelphia to sign the Bicentennial Day Declaration, reaffirming the United States' commitment to liberty, justice, and freedom. Following their stop in Pennsylvania, they headed to New York Harbor, where the First Lady Betty Ford joined in celebrating Operation Sail, which featured an array of ships sent by navies numerous countries showing support for the U.S. And finally, the eventful day ended in D.C., where the former president and first lady ended Independence Day watching fireworks from the White House balcony, appreciating 200 years of freedom, faith, and patriotism. Happy 4th to everybody. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com. Wherever you download podcasts, make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Trey, Josh, and Harold, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.